All right, welcome to your second video on Oscar Hijuelos, the Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love. This will be a short video just pulling out some of the themes and some of the motifs that the book plays out for us. As you're finishing for this Friday, remember that your reading response can be in relation to any part of the book, any part of the novel that we read from last week is open for your discussion. I'd like to see you make comparisons to several different parts. You know, if you're going to pull out one particular passage from early, you might see how this carries itself out later as it's repeated or maybe sort of overturned or rethought of. So just keep that in mind. But I want to start this week. I'm actually going to pull a quote that I saw when I was doing some prep work on this novel, a quote from one of our later authors in this class. It comes from Jhumpa Lahiri, the author of our novel The Namesake, later. And it has to do with being asked about this subgenre of immigrant fiction or immigrant literature. And I have a quote, and I will put this up on your Blackboard page so you can refer to this. But I'm going to read it right now just to sort of set up the way that I want to approach this short video. It says, and this is in response to being asked directly about this. She says, "I don't know what to make of the term immigrant fiction. Writers have always tended to write about the worlds they come from. And it just so happens that many writers originate from different parts of the world than the ones they ended up living in, either by choice or by necessity or by circumstance, and therefore write about those experiences. If certain books are to be termed immigrant fiction, what do we call the rest? Native fiction? Puritan fiction? This distinction doesn't agree with me. Given the history of the United States, all American fiction should be classified as immigrant fiction. Hawthorne writes about immigrants. So does Willa Cather. From the beginnings of literature, poets and writers have based their narratives on crossing borders, on wandering, on exile, on encounters beyond the familiar. The stranger is an archetype in epic poetry, in novels. The tension between alienation and assimilation has always been a basic theme." Okay, and again, this is Jhumpa Lahiri. This is a really, really important way of understanding a response to maybe getting too reductive in our classifying of types of literature. For her, she's saying that to simply boil something down to its immigrant fiction characteristics is, eliding past first of all, the message that we can apply this label to all literature in a lot of ways, but also we might be sort of unjustly pigeonholing it in a particular place that doesn't really give credence to its authenticity as being what the author knows, what the author has experienced, etc. Like she says, writers have a tendency to write about the worlds they come from, and it just so happens that some of them come from other places. We have this idea, whether or not we're going to continue saying something is quote-unquote immigrant fiction, we have this idea expressed in Hijuelos' novel. As we talked about last week in the video lecture, Hijuelos is writing about a Cuban immigrant experience at a particular time in the 20th century, and the story that he gives for us here of the brothers is played out against real life historical narrative, right? The idea of the Cuban immigrant, the Cuban musician influencing and changing the popular music scene of the mid-20th century is factually based. It's a documented part of our being American history, right? And so his brothers, Cesar and Nestor, are played out against real life figures, and their story, which we might say, happens to be the story of immigrants, is not just quote-unquote immigrant fiction, but also fiction about the U.S. experience at large, right? And so what I want to do is just quickly pull out some themes and some incidents that shed light on this issue for us. As we're about, not quite, but about halfway through our reading list, we can sort of revisit these things in our mind, the ways that we've been talking about migrant experiences and immigrant experiences and transgenerational and transcultural experiences that have to do with culture shock and assimilation and the commodification of cultures and being welcomed and being unwelcomed. All of those things, might return to us at this sort of halfway point to get our heads around what's being represented in the fiction here. Okay, so if we look, let's just pull out the two brothers and isolate them, and you might be sort of on the side that says, really, this is a story of Cesar, because he's telling this through his long, drawn-out, memory-driven narrative. But the counter version to that is perhaps that Cesar and Nestor are perhaps two aspects of one individual being, and I'm guessing that many of you have kind of pulled that idea together at some point in your reading, either last week or this week. And what we might even be able to see is extrapolate that and show them as two particular special halves or parts of an immigrant experience at this time. Okay, and even if you look at their basic characteristics, you might also begin to say, yeah, that looks like some of what Pfeiffer was talking about in terms of the refugees and immigrants. She has generalized, and which we might generalize in our understanding. But if you categorize Cesar as being this sort of raucous, hedonistic, pleasure-seeking, boisterous leader who is very much filled with that zest, of grasping onto life and all that it has to offer. And Nestor, on the flip side, represents a sort of dark and melancholic and soulful, brooding identity that's, he has a sort of desirous memory for a world that he left behind, represented by his love for Maria that was unfulfilled and drawn out, but yet maintains his sort of sadness throughout, his pining for her and what she represents. And we might, question, what is she meant to represent? Certainly she represents an old way of life, his past, his homeland, etc. But all in all, she encapsulates this idea that Nestor is sort of soulfully tied elsewhere, while Cesar is grasping on to this new opportunity and all of the pleasures that are represented here. So if you put these two halves together, you get the sort of bipolar identity that might encompass one individual, fictional or real life immigrant experience. And it just so happens that these two sort of work together symbiotically to create this narrative for Hijuelos. We might come back to that a little bit here as we move along through some of the other themes. Certainly, Hijuelos is very, very much a part of America's, progeny of the immigrant experience. We talked about his own particular family existing as immigrants and his life that went sort of back and forth culturally speaking and geographically speaking as well. But he also wants to sort of measure that sense of triumph and tragedy in this narrative, right? We get early on, we're introduced to this pinnacle of the brothers' success in America, this moment in time where they achieve mass stardom, on a certain level by appearing on the I Love Lucy show. And then along the way, we learn about minor tragedies and some major tragedies, including major moments of loss, all described through memory, and ultimately leading up to Cesar's particularly tragic downfall and spiral into this final ultimate scene in which he's sort of wasting away the days of his life as a nobody with perhaps no legacy and no family and no love and no more of this pleasure that he'd so much sought out in his life, right? That's again representative of the tragedies that have befallen this particular narrative of these immigrants, right? Triumph and tragedy measured out throughout the book, right? And that's, in a lot of ways, it's a realist portrayal of that immigrant experience that we're looking at. That we talked last time, or I keep saying that, I know, but I talked last time about, the Mambo music scene being part of the commodification of exotic cultural traits, right? It's sort of adopted by the American cultural population, and it becomes a significant means of commercial success, but yet it's not a full-on embrace of that particular cultural identity. It's picking and choosing. It's like I mentioned last time about all the many fast food Mexican restaurants that we have. It does not mean that we necessarily fully embrace that particular culture. It's commercial. It's consumer driven in a lot of ways. I might tack onto that a discussion of the world that we see in this novel. The 1950s American, quote-unquote, American traditions are being spelled out around the narrowed scenarios that we're led to. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we don't see often outside of the lens of Cesar's memories. And his memories are confined to these nightclubs and his daytime jobs and the sadness and the memories of Cuba and this and that. But around those, we have to understand, and our generalized knowledge gives us supplemental support in this area. The type of cultural scene that the 1950s America was driven by is largely one that's very oppressive to outsiders and to transgressors of norms. Right? We know this, even if we're not a great student of history, we know that conventions and traditions and norms were a huge part of this particular time in America, coming after the U.S. government has created a decided effort to point out and to discern anything that happens to be un-American, right? This is the era of Joseph McCarthy. This is the era of the Cold War. All of these things that create a sense of fear throughout the nation of others who might be out to destroy or take down our American lifestyle. This drives the center of America to congeal into something that is definable, recognizable, reproducible, and ultimately safe and secure. So a rush towards establishing that and eliminating and debasing all counterculture is a part of why we generally know of the 1950s as this blandish, nuclear family driven ideal, right? Even though it wasn't necessarily like that, our picture is sort of driven by that idealized version of life. And for the 1950s America, worldliness or a sense of the other in terms of culture, something like Mambo, is about the extent that mainstream culture might have wanted to go, right? Just knowing that there exists music that was influenced by another country and another culture, and we're just talking about the mambo here and the emergence of Cuban stars like Desi Arnaz, etc. That's about as far and as worldly as most of mainstream America would have gotten. And what Hijuelos does is he sort of parts that curtain and lets us look behind and see what life is like for these two brothers off screen, not when they're in that ultimate moment of being recognized as wonderful artists who have lives behind that art and who have lives behind that television appearance. And we see what's behind there. One other theme, and this brings me to the last connection that I'm going to make to how these brothers represent the immigrant experience at large of Cubans and Latinos at this time. One other huge theme that's played out in different scenarios is this sense of loss. And I might have mentioned that in the last video. And we talk a lot of times about loss in Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, this sense of a lost cultural identity, a loss of gender norms that have been left behind, etc., loss of familial story, all of that. Here we have this played out in a very similar way, but also in some other ways that help explain what it means to be assimilated or adapted, acculturated, or attempting to do either of those things. It also serves loss in particular as a way of measuring time. You'll note that the narrative is backward looking, right? It begins, with the young nephew of Cesar, opens up the novel, but then the meat of it really has to do with Cesar looking back from that moment in the hotel room and all the memories that come up from there. And the loss is one of the units of measuring time that really drives the story going from that point on. A couple examples of things that are lost, very specific items. Cesar has a lost daughter who signifies something very specific to him. This prominent lifestyle that he's led as a womanizer and as a man who's chasing, among other things, more and more lustful relationships, has, as a result of this, at some point, a daughter who represents for him a sensitive and unrealized part of himself, even though he does from time to time mention, keeping a communication with her, Mariela. But this is a lost part of him, and it signifies sadness and tragedy and something that he's cut himself off from or been cut off from. We also see, as I mentioned earlier, Nestor's lost love affair with Maria, the woman who he felt, and it's expressed throughout that there's a deep love connection, which may or may not have been as deep as is remembered. But we learn that this loss signifies for Nestor the onset of his particular melancholic state throughout, and his brooding and his sort of dreaming of her and what might have been and all those things. That's the particular loss that drives his emotion throughout. Nestor's death, sorry for those of you that haven't read that far, a little bit of a spoiler, but Nestor's death by car accident, which Cesar relates, and which actually sort of signifies a loss of part of Cesar as well. If we talk about them being symbiotic halves of the same individual, this is a loss for Cesar, who loses that particular part of himself, that balancing act for who he is in America is taken away from him at that point. And that's ultimately the last bit of loss that I have there. Cesar loses a sense of who he is and sort of degrades and goes on, and he still has this dominant sense of his own half of the identity, but without that other part, he begins to feel a particular sense of loss at being an American without this full identity of who he is. Certainly love is also something that is lost again and again in different forms. The idealized version, the Nestor's memory of Maria is driven by this, what could it have been? Even Cesar's lost daughter represents this what might have been, what could have been. But it also seems to function as a pining for the old days, the new days, the days in the U.S. that are peppered with, nights at the Mambo Club and many, conquered love interests for each of them. Those are the new days of chasing something, chasing a dream, chasing a potential. But the old days, the days back home in Cuba where these things were set forth, those seem to be implied by the chasing of love and the inability to connect full on idealized love. And the last thing that I want to mention, and I alluded to this earlier, is that ultimately all of this memory, all of this looking back at the past, at who they are and what they've been through and what they come from, builds itself up to a moment of complete and utter sadness in the recognition that Cesar, through all of this, begins to realize that his legacy, his ability to leave something behind, why we might say it's his music, as represented almost singly by this moment on the I Love Lucy show, but anything beyond that, might be lacking for him, and that realization by either him or us as the reader is meant to be this weighty, substantial sense of ultimate loss. All this that he and his brother have, quote unquote, given to the American public and the American cultural public, that is, has not produced for him that modicum of more traditional narrative where he will live on, and his family and his sons and daughters will accompany that narrative going forward after he's gone. And he's reminded of this when I believe he hears the other man and woman making love and in the other room, and it just sort of drives home that at this point in his life he has nobody. He has an ultimate sense of loss throughout. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Those are just, sort of handpicking some elements throughout the novel that might be of interest to you. Certainly there are lots of other ways that you can approach this in your reading responses. I want you, though, to go back, and as I said, I will put this up on Blackboard. Look at that Jhumpa Lahiri quote, and we might use this again, especially when we get to her novel a little bit later. But we might use this sense of questioning or challenging the categorizing of something like immigrant literature or immigrant fiction and the problems that it might create. So just make sure you take a look at that as I put it up here on Blackboard. And that's it for now. As always, send me any questions you have. We'll keep plugging along through the semester here. Thank you very much.